This is the Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life.
Today we are taking a look at, well, one of the absolute biggest legal decisions in American history, Brown v. Board of Education. And if you think this is some dusty old case about school districts, you really have to think again. We are diving into a battle over the most fundamental promise of American life.
Yeah, the promise that all citizens are supposed to stand equal in the eyes of their government.
Exactly. So our mission today is to figure out not just what the Supreme Court ruled, but why. Why they decided that separate educational systems were, in their words, inherently unequal.
And why the controversy from that one decision still, echoes in headlines today.
It's the perfect mission, really, because to get Brown, you have to start with the stakes. What was actually at risk here in 1954?
Well, everything. I mean, we're talking about the educational future, the psychological well-being, the social standing of millions of kids who are, trapped in these legally segregated systems across the country.
It was the whole foundation, the entire legal basis for segregation, which had been standing for decades under separate but equal, was about to.
Yeah.
Well, it was facing a complete collapse.
And that gets right to who won and who lost. The clear winners were the petitioners. The school children and their families in places like Topeka, Kansas, and Clarendon County, South Carolina.
They won a victory that started to dismantle those state-enforced barriers.
Absolutely. And the losers then were the state governments, the local school boards. Anyone who maintained that system of segregation, they lost their legal justification.
And this is the key. Why do we still feel it today? Because Brown didn't just change where kids went to school.
Not at all. It radically reshaped our laws, our politics. It set the precedent for basically every major civil rights challenge that came after it.
And it's so important to remember this wasn't just one neat little lawsuit, was it?
No, not at all. We're talking about 5 consolidated cases. So 5 different legal challenges that the Supreme Court bundled together because they all raised the same exact constitutional question.
And they were from all over.
All over. Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. It shows this was a national problem, not just a regional one.
So that brings us back to the central question they had to answer. Was segregating public schools just based on race, denying minority children equal educational opportunities?
And did it violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause? That was the whole legal fight right there.
To really get the audacity of the Brown decision, we have to go back in time to the world just before 1954, and it was messy. The legal landscape was just incredibly contradictory.
It was a total mess, and the source material really shows that because the lower courts in those 4 states had completely different findings.
Okay, so let's start with Topeka, Kansas, because that one really presents this key legal dilemma.
It really does. So in Topeka, the lower court, a 3-judge panel, actually found that segregation had and this is their quote, a detrimental effect on Negro children.
Wow. So they're admitting right there on the record that this is causing harm.
Yes. They acknowledge the emotional, the social damage, but, and this is the critical part, they still denied the plaintiffs any relief. They didn't order integration.
Why not, if they saw the harm?
Because they concluded that the tangible things, the buildings, the books, the teacher salaries, were, quote, substantially equal.
So the math checked out on the resources, but they admitted there was human damage. They were basically saying the injury is real, but our hands are tied by the old, separate but equal precedent.
That's it, exactly. And that finding in Topeka is the pivot point for the whole case. It showed the Supreme Court that you can't just focus on buildings and books if the act of separation itself is causing the harm.
Okay, so now compare that with the cases from the Deep South, right?
Right.
Clarendon County, South Carolina, and Prince Edward County, Virginia.
Right. And here it was different. The lower courts found that the Negro schools were, without a doubt, inferior. The tangible stuff, the facilities, the supplies, it wasn't even close.
So they ordered a fix.
They did. They ordered the districts to improve the schools, to, make them equal. But, and this is a huge but, they upheld the segregation system while those improvements were happening.
So the kids were denied immediate admission to the white schools. The solution wasn't integration, it was just better funded separation.
Precisely.
So in one state, if you prove the schools are equal, you're still harmed, but nothing changes. In another, if you prove they're inferior, you get a promise for better funding, but you're still segregated.
Exactly. And then you get to Delaware.
The odd one out.
The odd one out. In Delaware, the court also found the Negro schools were inferior. But instead of ordering a slow improvement plan, The judge granted the students immediate admission to the white schools.
Wait, really? So one court sees inferiority and says, fix it slowly, but Delaware's court sees inferiority and says, integrate now.
You got it. And that massive inconsistency proved that the whole system was broken. The only way to resolve this was for the Supreme Court to step in and decide if segregation itself was legal, regardless of the funding.
So when the Supreme Court finally takes this on, they start where they usually do, right? Looking at history.
Yeah.
The 14th Amendment.
Right. This is the amendment from right after the Civil War that guarantees equal protection. And they were really hoping the history would give them a clear answer on whether the authors meant to ban segregated schools.
But it didn't.
Not at all. The court was really honest about it. They found the historical evidence inconclusive.
Why? I mean, you'd think that would be clear.
Well, think about it. Back in 1868, when the amendment was ratified, public education wasn't this huge universal system we have now, especially in the South. Public schooling for Black children was almost non-existent. So the framers of the amendment weren't really debating these big statewide segregated school systems because those systems didn't really exist yet.
So history couldn't provide a roadmap for the 1950s. They had to pivot from what did the framers think to something else.
That's the brilliant legal move they made. The court said this question has to be answered based on the modern role of public education. They argued it had become this critical government function.
It's essential for being a good citizen, for getting a good job, for, your own personal success.
Exactly. And if a state is going to provide that opportunity, it has to be available to everyone on equal terms. And that's the argument that dismantles the old Plessy Foundation.
Which leads us right to the core idea. Let's just state it plainly, because this is the single most important sentence from the case.
Go for it.
Segregation in public schools solely on the basis of race violates the Equal Protection Clause because separate educational facilities are inherently unequal.
That's it. Inherently unequal. They said focusing only on the tangible stuff, the number of books, the quality of it's not enough. It misses the entire point.
I think an analogy really helps here. Imagine two brand new libraries. They're built with the exact same budget, same number of books, everything is identical. But over the door of one library, there's a sign that says, this library is for second-class citizens. The physical stuff is the same, right? But that social message, that intangible factor of being labeled inferior, it's devastating. The court said the real damage wasn't in the bricks and mortar, it was in that designation.
And that's exactly where the court went. They focused on the human impact, and they did something pretty revolutionary for the time. They relied on social science to back it up.
This is where it stops being about legal theory and starts being about the real lives of children. The human cost became the deciding factor.
Yes. The court zeroed in on the fact that segregation based on race creates this powerful sense of inferiority in children about their place in the community.
And they linked that feeling directly to their education.
Directly.
Yeah.
They cited studies showing that this sense of inferiority could hurt a child's motivation to learn and their overall development. The psychological injury was now a constitutional problem.
And they were able to connect that back to the court cases we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Even back to Kansas.
Yes, exactly. They pointed to those lower court findings, which had already said that segregation led to substantially inferior educational opportunities, even when the buildings and books were supposedly equal.
So the so what of all this reasoning is just. It's profound. The court concluded that it doesn't matter if you have mathematical parity in your funding. The segregated system itself denies minority children an equal education.
Right, because of the psychological harm and the message it sends.
And that was it. That was the final blow. The Supreme Court held that separate educational facilities are, by their very nature, inherently unequal.
But of course, making the ruling is one thing. Making it happen, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, that's the ruling in 1954. But the next phase, the implementation, was maybe even more difficult and controversial.
Oh, absolutely. The court knew what it was doing. They knew they had just ordered this radical change in places that were going to be fiercely resistant to it.
So they couldn't just issue one big order for the whole country to integrate overnight.
No. They knew it would require, in their words, careful case-by-case consideration. So they issued a second decision a year later in 1955. People call it Brown II.
And what did that one say?
It sent all the cases back down to the local district courts and told them to figure out how to desegregate. And it gave them that infamous instruction to proceed with all deliberate speed.
all deliberate speed. That phrase just became this huge source of controversy, didn't it?
Huge. To some, it sounded patient, practical, but to the families who had been fighting for justice for years, it just sounded like an excuse for endless delay.
And that's what happened. Many southern states launched what they called massive resistance.
They used every tactic you can imagine, legal and otherwise, to avoid complying. Some school districts just shut down public schools entirely rather than integrate.
So this created decades of more legal fights, resistance, even violence.
And we have to be clear, this controversy isn't just history. Reasonable people today still argue about the effectiveness of the remedies that followed, like busing, and whether the promise of Brown was ever truly fulfilled.
So let's connect it to today. Why are we still talking about Brown v. Board? Why is it still so relevant?
Because Brown is the bedrock. It is the philosophical and legal foundation for all of modern civil rights law. It set the precedent for challenging segregation everywhere, not just in schools.
So anytime you see a debate today about, say, equitable school funding or voting rights or access to public services,
the legal argument almost always traces back to the principle established in Brown. The government cannot use race to classify and disadvantage its citizens, especially when it comes to a fundamental right like education.
it established equal opportunity in education as a fundamental right.
And it still shows up today when we talk about de facto segregation, segregation that's not caused by a law, but by housing patterns and funding gaps that are legacies of the very system Brown tried to dismantle. The work is still going on.
So to recap the journey we took here, we went from these chaotic, contradictory legal fights in 4 states all the way to the Supreme Court's profound decision.
A decision that wasn't about buildings or books, but about the intangible effects of racial separation, the crushing sense of inferiority it creates.
The key takeaway has to be that simple, powerful phrase. Separate is inherently unequal when it comes to our fundamental rights.
That's the core of it.
And that's the knowledge we wanted to get from this deep dive.
And, here's a final thought for you to take with you. The court's decision really forced our entire legal system to evolve. It had to move beyond just comparing things you can count, like books and budgets, and start considering the psychological and social impact of its decisions, the effect on children's hearts and minds. So that raises a pretty big question for today. If the law has to consider the inherent social message when it comes to education, what other areas of our lives, of public policy, should be reviewed, not just for some kind of mathematical equality, but for the social message they send? What else out there is structurally equal, but inherently unequal?
You've been listening to The Daily Brief, one landmark court decision explained in plain English every day. Presented by FindCourtCases.com, this is your daily briefing on the law that shapes American life. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow with the next case.